good morning and welcome back to our second lesson on fractured fairy tales. So first of all, I thought we'd start with reminding ourselves of what we learned last week about fractured fairy tales. Last week was obviously our introduction to them, and I think the most important thing to remember about them is just this one word, that they are a retelling. I'll just note that down for you at the top. They are a retelling of the classics. And this can be anything. It can be even things down to as simple as a retelling of The Three Little Pigs or The Billy Goat's Gruff. Because what's important when it comes to fractured fairy tales, like we learned last week, is how you change them and what you do to change them. Another thing that we touched upon last week is that the fractured fairy tales often update the moral message of the story. An example of this that we had a quick look at last week is maybe something like The Little Mermaid. If you were to fracture The Little Mermaid and update the moral message to something more modern, can't type today, up to something more modern, perhaps you would do something like have the Little Mermaid teach herself to read and teach herself to speak instead of the prince intervening in this. Okay, so today we are going to fracture Cinderella, as you can see in the title here. I'd like you to have a quick look at this table before we do it. This table is brilliant for fracturing fairy tales because it really encourages us to consider every aspect of the story, and it encourages us to consider changing every aspect of the story, or gives us an opportunity to anyway. But I'd also like you to remember this table for other forms of story writing you might do. It'd be really useful for something like detective stories or drama writing or anything like that. Okay, so let's dive in and look at the first box. So the first box is somebody. So this is who is the story about. This is nice and easy to fill in for the original version. I'll just make the type a little bit smaller for you. Obviously we have Cinderella, the wicked stepmother and stepsisters, and also the prince. So we will write our own fractured version later in the lesson, but for now I'll just write some notes for us to consider when we get to this. So we can consider, do we even want a prince? We can also consider, do we want the stepsisters and the stepmother to be wicked? Perhaps we want to change the tone of this story and have it be a story of female friendship and strength instead of a story of love. We can also consider the fairy godmother element. Do we want to change who this is and how they act to help Cinderella? Do we also want Cinderella to have some more power over her own destiny? Something else to consider is what all of the characters wanted in the story. Perhaps this is something that we'd like to change. In the original version, it's not unreasonable to assume that the stepsisters wanted a husband. Also not unreasonable to assume is that Cinderella wanted to get away from her stepfamily. Whether we want to change what they wanted is slightly dependent on whether we want to change who the characters are and what they are like and how they act. But perhaps some notes that we can think about is whether in this version the stepsisters do want a husband. And also whether in this version if the stepfamily are as wicked as they are in the original. Okay, so there's some thoughts for us to mull over, and later in the lesson we'll start writing out our full fractured fairy tale version. Something else that we will think about later in the lesson is which version of the fairy tale, the original or our fractured version, is more interesting and why? There's obviously a lot to be learnt from the classics, but is there something particularly valuable to be gleaned from a fractured version, our fairy tale, and also some other fractured fairy tales that we've looked at previously? Related to this, we'll also discuss if the different versions teach us the same lesson, even though they are told in slightly different manners. And we'll also discuss why and why not this could be. I will see you later for that.